In the days after I'd returned to the hospital, working alongside my colleagues, we were all too prudent and too wise to ever bring up politics. The biggest challenge in adjusting to my work life after my country was reunited under a communist banner was learning how to work with those who were now in power. Because I was employed by a government-owned and operated hospital, I witnessed gross inefficiencies in which members of the Communist Party were promoted to senior management positions, such as chief of medicine, that they were wholly unqualified for such a post. The head of the hospital should always first and foremost be a physician who merits the title of being called a medically trained doctor. To my great dismay, the hospital administration was soon overrun with those who had no such expertise to oversee me and my fellow doctors. Being surrounded by political demagogues made for very frustrating work experiences, and I never expected life to return to the way things were ever again. In fact, many who were living in Ho Chi Minh City came to expect life would get definitively worse. My communist colleagues had privileges which I did not. Not only was their salary better, they had many more benefits, including housing provisions. By comparison, my wages were meager, and though I worked 8 hours a day, my monthly salary was only enough for a family of my size to subsist for a week. And although my pay was being severely undercut, I wasn't allowed to transfer to other hospitals without being granted explicit permission from those higher up. We all had to tighten our belts. Vietnam was a very poor country in the years after the war, and unemployment was rampant. In the 3 years following the fall of Saigon, the infrastructure, which was completely destroyed, still had not been rebuilt. Roads that had been damaged went unrestored, and the sewage system was swamped. Because there was no running water that was safe to drink in our home, personal hygiene went out the window. I don't recall my children ever having toothpaste or a toothbrush in our home during these tumultuous years. Even keeping soap consistently stocked in the house became a challenge. Though the house we lived in had 2 floors, a kitchen and a bathroom, plumbing for the toilet was inoperative, so everyone needed to walk 50 yards to and from an outhouse. Thee came home one afternoon, recounting to his brothers the long white tapeworm he'd been shocked to discover upon excreting. My young children continued to play barefoot in the swampy wetlands next to the outhouse, with no context that the waters they were splashing around in were heavily polluted. They'd play until twilight and come home to a dark house. We were lucky to get a few hours of electricity each day, as the power grid was down nearly all the time. Nightfall brought with it pitch-black evenings, but everyone learned to adapt to these substandard conditions. Keeping food on the table was a primary concern, and each morning began with a trip to the market to procure whatever we could afford. My children got by on 2 meals a day, often watered-down broth with rice and vegetable in the morning, and on many evenings dinner was nothing but rice and soy sauce. There were days when everyone went hungry. When my children's grandmother could get her hands on some chicken or duck, it would be bought in the morning and cooked by afternoon. After plucking its feathers, cutting the neck, and letting the blood drain, it would be prepared over an open fire in ceramic pots. The kind help of my wife's parents day to day was invaluable to me. My in-laws had built their wealth in Da Nang, where they had lived the greater part of their lives, making their fortune in tobacco fields. The majority of the people who were wealthy prior to the fall of Saigon had their assets seized. Now that life was vastly changed for all of us in Ho Chi Minh City, the only recourse for us was to sell all of our possessions, including our second home, and all of the furniture in it, so that we wouldn't starve. Raising a family of 4 children required my wife to be incredibly resourceful, and she did whatever it took for us to survive without an iota of complaint. Never one to moan and groan, Mai Du-Yan earned cash by selling pharmaceuticals. She assigned our sons Sang and Duong the task of collecting recyclable cans on the street to be turned in for a few coins. And before we were forced to sell our refrigerator, Sang also made and sold ice for several years. We knew many people who had grown just as desperate as us, trying to get out of Vietnam. Neighbors communicated in hushed tones about who'd already left, who didn't make it, and how to flee the country for those who were still willing to undertake the enormous risk. We felt utterly trapped, and something had to give, as there was no feasible way for our family to survive sustainably under the new regime.